June 1943, Detroit, Michigan. The air trembled with the sound of hammers. Steel rang against steel, echoing through the vast belly of the Detroit tank arsenal. Sparks showered like orange rain beneath the overhead cranes, and the smell of oil, thick, metallic, alive, hung in the lungs of every man inside. Outside, the streets smelled of gasoline and summer asphalt, while convoys of trucks rolled past with tarpaulin-covered cargo that glimmered faintly in the sun. America, still half asleep from the Great Depression, was now fully awake, an empire of motion. At the same hour, across the Atlantic, somewhere near Kassel, Germany, a group of engineers leaned over a map of Europe. They had been told the Americans were producing tanks by the thousands, crude, clumsy, inferior machines. One German colonel laughed and tapped his cigarette against an ashtray. "Quantity without quality," he muttered. Around him, the engineers nodded. They had seen the reports. The M4 Sherman. Thin armor, underpowered gun, high silhouette. To the German eye, it was an industrial toy. They believed in precision, in craft, in the cold perfection of the Tiger and Panzer. To them, war was engineering, and engineering art. But in Detroit, art took a different form. It came in the shape of endless repetition, in the steady pulse of the assembly line. Where the German engineers saw pride, the Americans saw rhythm. A tank wasn't sculpted. It was made. And it was made by everyone. The machinist from Ohio, the welder from Alabama, the woman from Pennsylvania holding a rivet gun in her gloved hands. Their skill wasn't in mastery of detail, but in mastery of time. Every hour was a victory against entropy. The contradiction was profound. The Germans believed civilization was preserved by excellence, by the few who could achieve it. The Americans were proving civilization could be multiplied, by the many who could maintain it. Reports from the front were slow to change minds. In Tunisia and Sicily, Shermans burned. Yes, but they also arrived. They arrived in numbers that defied arithmetic. A battalion destroyed was replaced within weeks. Crews lost were retrained. Logistics, that invisible art, became the weapon no general could outflank. German officers began to notice a pattern. Every time they thought the Allies exhausted, more tanks appeared. The American machines looked crude, but the system behind them was not. It was alive, self-feeding, relentless. In June 1943, deep in the heart of Detroit, a visitor from Washington walked the catwalk above the assembly floor. Below him stretched a metallic river, turret shells, gearboxes, engines, all flowing toward the light of the final inspection doors. He wiped the sweat from his brow and whispered, "It's like watching civilization being forged." And perhaps it was. The factory was no longer just a building. It was an organism breathing steam and electricity. It was the sound of democracy in production. At night, when the workers filed out, their faces were gray with soot, but their hearts were light. They were not soldiers, but they knew they were part of something enormous. The moon rose over the foundry chimneys, and from miles away, the glow of molten metal painted the horizon red, as if the city itself were aflame with purpose. The German engineers could not see this. In their world, power came from control, hierarchy, specialization. In Detroit, power came from coordination. No one had to be perfect. They only had to keep moving. It was a quiet revolution in philosophy, the triumph of system over style. In the shadows of the war, an idea was being born, that the true strength of a nation lay not in its elite, but in its infrastructure. When a captured German officer was later shown footage of the Chrysler plant, the rows of Shermans rolling off the line, one after another, smoke curling from their new painted hulls, he reportedly shook his head in disbelief. "That is not engineering," he said. "That is sorcery." He was not entirely wrong. For the first time in history, a country had turned mass production into mass survival. Steel had become moral substance, the embodiment of will, cooperation, and endurance. What began as industrial routine was transforming into something metaphysical, a belief that abundance could defend freedom. By the end of 1943, 50 tanks a day left the Detroit arsenal, 50 rolling monuments to efficiency, rolling proof that imagination could be industrialized. And somewhere in Germany, another engineer stared at the reports, silently doing the math, realizing that perfection, however beautiful, was losing to repetition. They didn't know it yet, but they were walking into the future. Rain streaked the glass of the locomotive window, blurring the forests into streaks of gray and green. The train rattled east, carrying a small delegation of German engineers, men of immaculate uniforms and measured pride. They had been chosen for a mission of observation, an honor bestowed by the Ministry of Armaments. Their orders were simple: study Allied production methods, compare efficiency, report findings. What they expected to find was confirmation that Germany, though smaller, remained intellectually superior. They carried notebooks filled with sketches of Tiger transmissions, cooling systems, tolerances written to the hundredth of a millimeter. Precision was their religion. As they rode, the countryside whispered of strain. Bomb craters scarred the meadows. Refugees walked in silence along the tracks, faces hollow, carrying bundles of everything they owned. Factories worked through the night, floodlights blazing against the blackout curtains. The engineers noticed the fatigue, the rails vibrating with war's exhaustion, but said nothing. To question the machine was to invite suspicion. In their minds, industrial civilization was a ladder. The higher the craftsmanship, the greater the nation. Mass production, as they saw it, was the language of mediocrity, the leveling of greatness by quantity. The Führer himself had once declared, "Better one perfect tank than 10 imperfect." It was logic wrapped in pride, and pride wrapped in blindness. Meanwhile, across the ocean, visitors from Britain and the Soviet Union arrived in America to witness something else entirely. They came through the steel gates of the Detroit arsenal with curiosity and quiet disbelief. It was like stepping into a new continent, a cathedral of machinery. Conveyor belts snaked like arteries through the vast hall. Pneumatic hammers boomed in steady rhythm. The floor shivered under the movement of cranes hauling 30-ton hulls like toys. A Soviet observer, writing in his notebook, described the sensation. "The air here is alive. They do not make tanks. They grow them." The Americans greeted them not with ceremony but with noise. Sirens, whistles, music from the canteen radio blending with the clang of steel. There was no myth of perfection here. Weld seams were rough, paint jobs uneven. But the rhythm was flawless. From one station to the next, a tank became more complete. Treads fitted, engine installed, turret locked, cannon tested. Every 45 minutes, another Sherman rolled toward daylight. To the visitors, it felt like an illusion. Could such speed produce reliability? Could democracy, so loud and unorganized in speech, be so synchronized in motion? They asked the foreman, a man named Charles Keller, how such output was possible. He laughed and wiped his hands on a rag. "We just keep it simple," he said. "Everybody knows his job, and no one's too proud to fix a mistake." That sentence, ordinary, unpolished, lingered longer than the noise of the factory. In those few words lay the cultural difference between empire and enterprise, between ideology and system. The Germans built machines to glorify theory. The Americans built them to work. By evening, when the floodlights flickered on and shadows stretched across the tank's olive-green skins, the visitors walked along the final inspection line. The air was warm, metallic. Oil shimmered in puddles like black mercury. From the loudspeakers came a voice reading the day's count. 48 completed, 2 in test. Applause broke out, not forced, but genuine. Men and women cheered as if they had just launched ships instead of tanks. Far away, in Berlin, the latest production report told another story. Shortages of manganese, rubber, and fuel. Delays in rail delivery. Allied bombers had cut the arteries of precision. The engineers there still believed in perfect machines, but the machines could no longer reach the battlefield fast enough to matter. And yet, in the minds of the German observers, the old arrogance held on. "This is a circus," one of them wrote privately. "They build too fast. They waste material. They lack discipline." But the thought didn't rest easily. Something inside him, perhaps the sound of that steady rhythm, made him pause. He watched a young woman in overalls climb into a tank, checking the periscope alignment. She hummed as she worked, tapping the bolts with a wrench, satisfied with the echo. The tank would leave the factory tomorrow, cross the Atlantic in a cargo ship, and perhaps meet its fate on an Italian hillside. Yet for her, it was a day's honest labor. One more contribution to something immense and impersonal. Disbelief was giving way to curiosity. Behind the clamor of industry, the visitors sensed an unfamiliar force, collective confidence, a civilization that believed not in perfection but in progress. And somewhere deep within the noise and light, they began to feel it, the quiet hum of inevitability. Snow fell outside the tall windows like drifting ash. Inside, the factory glowed with orange light, a man-made sunrise that never dimmed. The temperature near the furnaces reached 90 degrees, while beyond the walls the Michigan wind howled below freezing. Yet no one complained. Sweat and frost coexisted. It was the climate of production. The German observers, now granted special access by American liaisons, stood on a grated platform overlooking the main assembly floor. They wore earmuffs against the roar, but still, the sound invaded their chests like thunder in slow motion. Below, hundreds of workers moved with coordinated purpose. Welders bent over seams, sparks tracing their outlines. Overhead cranes glided like patient beasts carrying turret shells. Pneumatic tools barked in rhythm. The visitors had seen weapon factories before, but not this. This was less an industry than an ecosystem. Each shift began with the siren. The workers entered as if into a ritual, coffee mugs steaming, toolboxes clattering. They took their places along the line. The parts arrived in sequence. Gearbox housings from Cleveland, armor plates from Pittsburgh, engines from Chicago, each carried by rail, each fitting into place like organs in a living body. The system consumed raw material and exhaled tanks. At first, the German engineers searched for chaos. Surely somewhere inefficiency lurked. Loose tolerances, careless inspection, waste. But every question they asked led to another layer of organization. Each worker knew his timing to the second. Each foreman tracked progress on chalkboards updated every hour. Breakdowns were met not with blame but with motion. Tools changed hands and the line kept flowing. In their notebooks, they began to record numbers. Average assembly time per Sherman, 10 hours, 15 minutes. Average component rejection rate, 3.2%. Daily output, between 45 and 52 units. The figures seemed impossible, but the proof stood before them. Rows of completed tanks idling in the test yard, engines rumbling beneath the snow. In Germany, the same process would have taken weeks. Every bolt inspected twice, every plate hand-fitted, every decision approved by a senior engineer. It produced beauty, yes, but beauty that bled time. In Detroit, the system replaced artistry with architecture. The blueprint was no longer of the machine, but of the process itself. At lunch, the visitors joined the workers in the canteen, a warehouse of smells, coffee, stew, cigarette smoke. Men and women sat together, uniforms smeared with graphite and paint. There was laughter, quick jokes, a radio playing swing music. Nobody saluted anyone. The foreman ate beside the janitor. Hierarchy had dissolved into camaraderie. For the German delegation, this was the greater shock. Efficiency born from equality. It defied every doctrine they'd been taught. After lunch, they followed an American production manager, a wiry man named Benjamin Freed, through the inspection wing. He spoke with quiet authority. "We don't look for perfection," he said. "We look for consistency. If a part fails, we fix the process, not the person." The sentence hung in the air like a challenge to centuries of management philosophy. Freed pointed to a wall chart, where colored pins marked production rates by hour. Red pins meant delay, green meant completion, yellow indicated adjustment. The pattern was beautiful in its simplicity, a visual pulse of progress. "It's not genius," he added, "just geometry and discipline." The Germans scribbled in silence. What they saw here was not chaos but designed abundance. A society that had learned to make coordination an instinct. The machinery was loud, but the order behind it was serene. In every piston, every gear, every welded joint lay a trace of the invisible mathematics of democracy. Distributed responsibility, multiplied output. At dusk, the factory quieted. The last tank of the shift, hull number 12856, rolled toward the loading dock. Its fresh paint gleamed beneath the overhead lamps, the white star on its side still wet. The air smelled of iron and hot oil. Workers stood back watching it go, their faces orange in the fading light. From the catwalk, one of the German visitors whispered, half to himself, "It's not a factory. It's a civilization in motion." He was right. What they had mistaken for industrial noise was, in truth, a symphony. The disciplined rhythm of an open society discovering its own power. They had entered expecting to study machines. They were beginning to understand they were studying systems. And systems, unlike machines, do not rest when the lights go out. The reports arrived not as rumors now, but as arithmetic. 50 tanks a day from Detroit, 35 from Lima, 20 from pressed steel. In total, the United States was producing nearly 2,000 Shermans a month. The German engineers who had once scoffed now stared at the figures in silence. Numbers so large they ceased to be quantities. They became weather. A phenomenon of civilization. They had been trained to measure power in millimeters, the thickness of armor, the velocity of a shell, the angle of a turret ring. But these new metrics, tons per month, engines per week, gallons of fuel per hour, belonged to another dimension of war. The mathematics of movement, the mathematics of time. In Berlin, a memo from the Reich Ministry for Armaments noted with unease, American tank production exceeds total German armored output by a ratio of 5-to-1. Their capacity for replacement neutralizes qualitative advantage. Neutralizes qualitative advantage. 4 words that captured the collapse of an era. At the Detroit Arsenal, the statistics lived in motion. Between January and May 1944, the plant consumed 230,000 tons of steel, 15 million rivets, 3.5 million gallons of paint, and enough wiring to circle the earth twice. 40 trains arrived daily with supplies. 40 more departed carrying machines of war. The line never truly stopped. Maintenance was conducted mid-flow, workers rotating like cogs in a clock that refused to lose a second. Each number was not just a fact. It was proof of will. Behind every figure stood thousands of hands and hearts, men and women from every state, every accent, every faith. Statistics had faces, though few would ever know their names. A memo pinned to the factory bulletin board read, "Remember, every minute saved here saves a life out there." In the visitor's journal, the German observer who once mocked the circus, a new tone appeared. "It is not genius that wins this war. 'Tis multiplication. They have made time itself into a weapon." He was not exaggerating. In the field, every destroyed Sherman was replaced by another in days, sometimes hours. Spare parts arrived before the need was reported. Fuel convoys moved with mechanical precision, guided by logistics officers armed with clipboards and slide rules. The American war machine was not a beast of instinct. It was an equation that solved itself continuously. And so, numbers became emotion. 50 tanks a day, 50 stories, 50 crews, 50 symbols of endurance. One could almost feel the weight of the arithmetic pressing down on the world. It was the hum of engines multiplied into destiny. In Germany, the same calculations bred despair. The Tiger, with its 88mm gun and 100mm armor, could destroy a Sherman in a single shot. But while the Tiger took 300,000 man-hours to build, the Sherman took 10,000. The math was merciless. Every Tiger that emerged from its hangar met 10 Shermans before dusk. Even perfection, when outnumbered, begins to rust. Letters from the front tell the same story. An Allied tanker wrote home from Normandy, "They say the German tank is better. Maybe so, but ours is here and his is not." That's what counts. The numbers carried an ethical gravity. Industrial democracy had proven something unexpected, that freedom, when organized, could outproduce tyranny. The open system, with all its flaws, was faster, more resilient, more human. It could absorb error because it trusted correction more than fear. In the mathematical silence of war, that trust became the most powerful constant. By the summer of 1944, as Shermans rolled through the hedgerows of France, the equations reached their final clarity. The Detroit Arsenal alone had delivered more tanks than the entire Axis combined. On the chalkboards above the factory floor, production totals were updated each night. 22,234 completed. The digits glowed beneath the lamplight like an epitaph for an old world. The German engineers no longer laughed. They no longer compared calibers or tolerances. They simply stared at the statistics, as one might stare at the ocean. vast, impersonal, endless. The numbers were not exaggerations. They were truth made visible. And within that truth, a revelation was forming. That civilization itself could be measured not only by the beauty of what it made, but by the speed at which it learned to make together. By July, the noise of war had become a background hum. Engines, trains, telegrams, footsteps. The world was no longer divided between front and rear. Every town, every worker, every family was part of the same pulse. And yet amid this grand machinery of production, there were still moments of stillness. Moments when the human spirit showed through the steel. In Detroit, shift whistles blew at dawn and dusk. Between them, 12 hours of labor. But in those hours, something quiet and profound took place. A young woman named Mary Lewis, 21, wiped her hands on a rag after welding turret seams. She kept a photograph of her husband, a tank driver in Italy, taped inside her locker. "When I weld," she said once to a reporter, "I think maybe he'll sit behind the gun of this one." She wasn't alone. Across the arsenal, thousands of such invisible threads bound factory and battlefield into one living fabric. The German observers noticed it too, this strange warmth beneath the industrial rigor. They watched a supervisor stop a machine to help a new worker tighten her gloves. They saw foremen share cigarettes, mechanics fix each other's mistakes without reprimand. No shouting, one noted in his journal. No fear. They work as though each believes the other is competent. It was perhaps the most radical thing they had seen in America. Trust as infrastructure. Where their own society built obedience, this one built faith. The quiet faith that cooperation worked better than command. After hours, the canteen filled with life. The jukebox played Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. Coffee cups clinked. People laughed at jokes about ration cards and rubber shortages. A war widow taught a young man from Kansas how to dance. Outside, fireflies blinked over the cooling tanks in the yard. Even amid the clang and smoke, joy persisted, not loud but resilient. Across the ocean, Sherman crews found the same spirit. In Normandy and the Ardennes, they worked in mud and smoke, fixing broken tracks with bare hands, sharing rations with French children. One soldier wrote in his diary, "A French farmer gave us bread still warm. We gave him chocolate," he cried. "We didn't understand a word of each other, but we understood everything." The German engineers, now following these accounts through captured reports, began to feel a quiet dissonance. Their world had taught them that power meant dominance, that efficiency demanded hardness. But these people, these Americans, these allies, fought with laughter, with generosity, with disorder that somehow always resolved itself. They built tanks as if they were building trust. When one German delegate returned to Berlin, he presented his findings not to the ministry but to his own conscience. His report, later found in the archives, reads, "They have replaced the whip with a handshake. They believe equality can be an engine. Perhaps that is their real weapon." In Detroit, Mary Lewis received a telegram in October 1944. Her husband's tank had been destroyed near Bologna. He was alive, recovering. The next day she went back to work. When the foreman offered her leave, she shook her head. "He'll need a new one," she said simply, and picked up her welding torch. That small moment, one among thousands, revealed something deeper than production. It revealed purpose. The war's moral architecture was not built on ideology, but on empathy, on the conviction that strangers could rely on one another even when they had never met. For the German engineers, this realization was disorienting, almost painful. The precision of their machines, the symmetry of their theories suddenly felt hollow beside the asymmetry of human compassion. They had spent years designing weapons. Now they were beginning to study people. In the Arsenal cafeteria one afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the high windows, one of them, a quiet man named Reinhardt, turned to his American escort and said, "You seem to trust everyone." The escort smiled. "We have to," he replied. "There's too much to build for one man to do it alone." Reinhardt looked out across the hall. Workers laughing, music playing, steam rising from the coffee pots, and nodded slowly. For the first time in his life, he envied disorder. The tanks would continue to roll. The war would grind on, but somewhere between the blast furnaces and the jukebox, the visitors had encountered something they could neither quantify nor deny. They realized civilization was not built on hatred, but on how people treated strangers. The snow had melted from the rail yards outside Detroit, leaving puddles that mirrored the smokestacks. The air smelled of thawing earth and diesel. Production still thundered day and night, but within the minds of the foreign observers, the once skeptical German engineers, something had shifted. They were no longer watching a system. They were studying a civilization. Weeks of observation had turned into quiet education. They began to read American newspapers, to listen to the morning radio, to walk through the neighborhoods beyond the factory gates. There, among row houses and small groceries, they saw the same pattern that defined the arsenal: cooperation without coercion. At night, they dined with the foremen's families, heard laughter over stew, saw wives balancing ration books beside maps of Europe pinned to kitchen walls. They listened to jazz drifting from living rooms, that syncopated optimism which had no translation. It was messy, improvisational, and utterly alive. For men raised on hierarchy, it was revelation. They were learning that democracy was not chaos. It was choreography without a conductor. One evening, in a boarding house near 8 Mile Road, the youngest of the visiting engineers, Hans Becker, found himself reading a pamphlet left by a worker. The cover bore a simple title, "Why We Fight." Inside were photographs of families, farms, and city streets, ordinary lives defended by extraordinary effort. A line caught his eye: "We do not fight for victory alone. We fight so that free men may keep building together." He read it twice. It was not propaganda. It was instruction. The moral blueprint of the world he was standing inside. Days later, on a factory tour, Becker asked the plant manager if anyone ever worried that machines would replace people. The manager chuckled. "Machines don't build things," he said. "People do. Machines just keep up." That answer stayed with Becker longer than any technical detail. It was, in its way, a definition of civilization itself. Across the ocean, similar lessons unfolded in the dust of liberated France, in the mud of Belgium, in the ruins of once-occupied towns. Soldiers from every corner of the Allied nations, farmers from Iowa, miners from Wales, students from Warsaw, shared cigarettes and rations with strangers. Cooperation was not ordered. It simply happened. It was the spontaneous grammar of freedom. At the arsenal, the shift bells still marked the hours, but time itself felt different. The Germans, once observers, began to assist in small ways, checking gauges, verifying blueprints, discussing engine tolerances with the American engineers. The line between visitor and participant blurred. Learning had replaced pride. In the evenings, they gathered in the design office, sketching diagrams under the hum of fluorescent lights. There were no guards now, only colleagues. The air smelled of graphite and machine oil. On the wall, someone had pinned a quote from Henry Kaiser: "Problems are just opportunities in work clothes." One of the Germans copied it into his notebook. Later, he would tell his son, "That sentence taught me more about engineering than any professor. Education came not from lectures, but from exposure to efficiency, to tolerance, to imperfection accepted and corrected." They had lived within a system that punished error. Here they witnessed a culture that learned from it. In that difference lay the seed of progress. On Sundays, when production slowed, the visitors attended local gatherings, church picnics, band concerts, community meetings. There they saw something they could never have imagined under the Reich: open disagreement without fear. Citizens arguing, voting, deciding. From chaos emerged clarity. From debate, direction. It was manufacturing of another kind, the manufacturing of consent. The more they observed, the more they questioned what they had once believed immutable. Could freedom and efficiency truly coexist? Could equality, that dangerous word, actually produce order rather than disorder? The evidence was all around them. The tanks, the trains, the laughter, all parts of the same design. In March 1945, as the first rumors of Germany's collapse reached them, they felt no triumph from the Allies, only fatigue and a strange compassion. One American worker put it simply: "We just want the killing to stop so we can start fixing things." That sentence, humble, unadorned, contained the heart of the civilization they had spent months misunderstanding. By April, the visitors no longer took notes. They no longer measured with rulers or stopwatches. They listened. They asked questions not of machines but of people. "What will you do after the war?" one asked a young draftsman. The man smiled. "Build cars again, maybe houses. Anything that moves forward." The answer was both literal and symbolic. Movement itself, progress, was the American creed. When the delegation finally prepared to leave, the factory paused briefly to acknowledge them. No ceremony, no speeches, just nods, handshakes, and the hiss of the line starting again. Outside, the air smelled of spring rain and hot steel. The world was already changing. They walked toward the train station, each carrying notebooks filled not with schematics, but with questions. Questions that would follow them home and haunt them long after the war. They were not prisoners of walls, but students of a civilization. The train that carried them home moved through a landscape of silence. Fields once neat and geometric were now craters and ash. Bridges lay twisted across the rivers like broken ribs. The station smelled of soot, boiled potatoes, and sorrow. Here and there, children stared at the passing carriages with hollow eyes. The war was over, but it had not yet ended. For the returning engineers, the contrast was almost unbearable. They had left a land of motion and color, of noise and confidence. Now, they stepped into a gray world that seemed suspended between humiliation and hunger. Their boots crunched on streets lined with ruins. Walls still stood, but roofs were gone. A single piano survived in a bombed-out house, its keys exposed to the rain. Someone had painted on a surviving wall, "Wir leben noch." "We are still alive." They carried notebooks filled with figures and observations from America. But the numbers now felt irrelevant, sterile against the enormity of loss. What haunted them were not statistics, but moments. A factory whistle, a woman's laughter, a sentence about trust. These memories felt like contraband from another civilization. When they reported to the remnants of the ministry, their words were met with disbelief. "You exaggerate," an official said. 50 tanks a day? Possible." "No," one engineer replied quietly. "Not impossible. Just different." He explained what he had seen, the rhythm, the cooperation, the absence of fear. They listened, but the logic of their old system could not absorb it. A civilization built on obedience could not comprehend power born from equality. In the months that followed, the returning men dispersed, some to ruined universities, others to reconstruction projects, a few to silence. But in each, a subtle transformation had taken root. They had seen an alternative future. When they spoke of industry now, they spoke not of precision, but of participation. When they spoke of progress, they no longer meant domination, but recovery. One of them, the younger engineer Becker, joined a rebuilding effort near Stuttgart. He taught apprentices how to standardize tools and share designs across workshops. "It's faster if everyone knows everything," he said. To the old masters, it sounded naive. To the young, it sounded like hope. He no longer dreamed of perfect machines. He dreamed of useful ones. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Detroit arsenal began to wind down its wartime rhythm. The sirens still blew at dawn, but the urgency had softened. Tanks were replaced by tractors, cannons by cranes. Workers left with calloused hands and quiet pride, knowing that they had built something greater than steel. They had built the infrastructure of peace. In Germany, the engineers who had seen that miracle began to teach again. They taught not only formulas and tolerances, but ethics, the moral mechanics of production. One lecture at the Technical University of Munich in 1947 recorded these words: "We believed excellence was born from control, but the Americans showed us it can be born from trust. Efficiency is not speed. It is belief made practical." Their students listened, wide-eyed, to stories of a place where foremen and welders ate together, where arguments produced innovation instead of punishment. The story spread quietly, a whisper of another way to live. Years later, when the Marshall Plan brought American tools and blueprints to Europe, those same men recognized the philosophy behind the machinery. Standardization, interchangeability, cooperation, the invisible lessons of Detroit had come home disguised as engineering aid. By 1948, German factories began to hum again, not with arrogance, but with gratitude, not with the rhythm of conquest, but of reconstruction. The world was rebuilding itself not through ideology, but through imitation, imitating systems that worked because they trusted the ordinary worker's intelligence. The engineers who once laughed at mass production now taught it. The same men who had mocked the circus of Detroit now used its methods to make tools, cars and machines that would fuel a new Europe. Becker, now older, wrote in his memoir, "In America I learned that strength is not the enemy of gentleness. They build with faith, faith that the next man will do his job. It is a simple faith, but it moves mountains." By the decade's end, the sound of factories had returned to Germany, not the roar of war, but the murmur of rebuilding. Children played again in streets that smelled of coal and new paint. The engineers watched them and understood what they had never grasped before. That civilization was not the product of genius, but of cooperation. Not the triumph of one mind, but the coordination of millions. They had gone out as observers of an enemy's factory. They returned as witnesses of a human idea. And as the first post-war winter settled over the Rhine, Becker stood outside his rebuilt workshop, listening to the engines in the valley below, tractors, not tanks, and smiled. The sound was familiar, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer the noise of industry. It was the sound of redemption. The arsenal was quiet now. Grass had begun to grow through the cracks in the old loading yard. A few pigeons nested in the gantry beams where once cranes had lifted engines the size of horses. Inside the vast halls, sunlight filtered through dusty windows, turning floating particles of steel and ash into golden motes. The air no longer smelled of oil and paint, but of rust, rain, and memory. The war had ended 5 years earlier, but its rhythm, that deep industrial heartbeat, still echoed through the century. The machines that once built Shermans now built tractors, cars, and turbines. The factory that had once fed the front now fed the world. Civilization had taken its next breath. From Europe came letters, photographs, blueprints, fragments of gratitude. The German engineers who had once visited returned as correspondents and collaborators. Some wrote of rebuilding, of new apprentices, of workshops rising amid ruins. Others wrote of philosophy. One letter, signed simply Hans B. Says, "I have begun to teach my students that the line between freedom and order is thinner than a sheet of steel, and that the Americans showed me it can hold." In post-war Germany, a new industrial ethic had taken root. Not the worship of perfection, but the practice of participation. They had seen that production could be a moral act, that mass creation need not mean mediocrity. It could mean inclusion. Every hand mattered. Every hour counted. That was the invisible inheritance of the Sherman factory. Back in Detroit, the workers who had once built tanks for battle now built cars for peace. The sound of engines still filled the air, but it was a different song. Lower, steadier, more domestic. The welders, the machinists, the women who had once been Rosies, now became mothers, teachers, citizens. They carried the rhythm of the arsenal within them, like a heartbeat passed from one generation to the next. If you listened carefully on a quiet morning, you could still hear it, the ghost hum of the assembly line, the whisper of air through vents, the echo of distant hammers. The same music that had once terrified Europe now served to feed it. History had turned the weapon into a lesson. The lesson was simple yet profound. Civilization does not depend on who rules, but on how we build together. The Germans had believed that excellence could only be achieved by the few. The Americans had shown that greatness could emerge from the many. And in that revelation lay the moral axis of the modern world. By 1950, the statistics had faded into textbooks. 50 tanks a day, 2,000 a month, 22,000 by war's end. All astonishing, but no longer the point. What endured was the philosophy those numbers represented. The power of coordination, the faith in shared purpose, the dignity of work done without fear. A film reel from that era shows the final days of the arsenal's wartime output. In the footage, a Sherman rolls through the great doors into sunlight. Workers stand beside it, wiping sweat from their faces, cheering softly. There is pride, but also humility. The awareness that the machine before them is both artifact and symbol. Behind it, the light glints off the steel beams like the ribs of a cathedral. The camera pans upward, and for a brief moment, the viewer sees not a factory, but a monument to cooperation. That is where history's real turning point occurred. Not in battle, but in the recognition that abundance, when disciplined by purpose, could become virtue. The German engineers had returned home transformed. The Americans had returned to peace transformed. Both had glimpsed the same truth, that progress is not a miracle of genius, but the organized expression of goodwill. Years later, when Becker visited Detroit again as part of a reconstruction mission, he stood before the silent factory and closed his eyes. He could still hear the clatter, the shouts, the siren that once signaled the start of each shift. But what he remembered most was not the noise nor the numbers, but the people, the laughter in the canteen, the equality in motion. He picked up a small piece of scrap steel from the ground, turned it over in his hand, and smiled. This, he whispered, was the sound of freedom being manufactured. The camera of history pulls back now, from Becker, from Detroit, from the ruins and rebuildings of the 20th century, until the entire industrial world hums like a single vast engine. The line between past and future blurs. The lesson endures. The true victory of freedom was not destruction, but demonstration. And as the sun sets over the empty factory yard, a single symbol remains, a rusted wrench lying in a pool of rainwater, catching the last light like polished silver. They left with the taste of democracy, sweet, real, unforgettable.